Professor Heidi Abramse, Acting Executive Dean for the Faculty of Health Sciences, Professor Christopher Stein, inductee, Professor Ashraf Guvadia, respondent and academic head of the Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, Rahima Moosa Mother and Child Hospital, and at the University of Witwatersrand, senior leaders of the university, members of Senate and other academics, distinguished guests, students, all who have joined us. Sanibonani, goeienaand, good evening, Tobela. I always read that and I think we're missing out a particular group, and that's the family. Good evening to the family of Professor Stein. It's good to see you. I've been introduced to some of you, and I'm very happy that you could join us this evening. It is indeed a great honor and special privilege for me to welcome you to the Professorial inaugural lecture of Professor Stein. As I do so, I wish to express a warm welcome to his loved ones, special guests, and colleagues. This is indeed a proud and joyful, yet a landmark moment for all of you, for Professor Stein, for us here at UJ, and higher education in South Africa and beyond. The inauguration of professors is a public ceremony in which newly appointed professors are inducted into the office by the Vice-Chancellor and deliver their inaugural addresses. The ceremony has its roots in medieval university and serves multiple purposes. Firstly, it is an expression of welcome and an entry for new professors joining circle of colleagues who are already professors. Secondly, it provides a platform for the professors to display their expertise in the discipline and showcase their research. In colonial traditions subscribed to by universities, assuming the role of professor refers to the gown and the cap. Once we have listened to the inaugural address, the gown, denoting the professorship, will be formally assumed. Today we gather to bear witness to the entry of Professor Stein to the illustrious community of scholars at the university. It is a celebration of the contributions to the discipline and ultimately the impact on society. Professors provide a university with its identity, character, academic legitimacy, and integrity. The inaugural lecture is a rite of passage following the confirmation of the appointment of the person as a professor. I'm just going to quickly tell them or share with them an anecdote, Christopher. So I don't know if many of you know, but Professor Stein actually also received his professorship last year, is that correct? And when I saw the list this year, I said to the people who are arranging the event, but I don't see Chris Stein's name on the list. So he can actually blame me that he's on the list this year. And he said to me, thank you so much for remembering that I had to give an inaugural address. But I think it's an absolute special moment and a rite of passage for all professors. This evening, we will listen to Professor Stein as the gown goes to town. By this I mean that the power of the inaugural address is when the expertise is showcased beyond the corridors of the university and reverberates within society. It stands out as a moment of pride for the incumbent, the family, fellow scholars, the university, and ultimately society. For the German philosopher and diplomat Humboldt, a university referred to the whole community of scholars and students engaged in a common search for truth. Newman talked about teaching universal knowledge. Recently, universities have been viewed as instrumentalist, serving the purpose of the economy or utilitarian in purpose. I would hope that we can break out of these narrow conceptualizations and reflect on the university as contributing to the public good. Edward said in an article on defiance and taking positions, offers a formulation of the ideal role of the true intellectual, and I quote, one who commands a vast knowledge of the individual's discipline, who is rigorous in the analysis of literature, who views being an intellectual as a vocation, the intellectual who considers it necessary to step into the public sphere and to speak truth to power, namely to question, interpret, and understand authority rather than merely consolidating it. To step out of the boundaries of the academy, to connect oneself, to affiliate oneself, to align oneself with an ongoing process or contest of some sort, perhaps with the aim of improving the lot of the oppressed. The intellectual who functions as a kind of public memory to recall what is forgotten or ignored, to make the connections that are otherwise hidden, and to provide alternatives for mistaken policies, end of quote. It remains then for us as a university with a Pan-African vision to derive our mandate as intellectuals and as professors. How do we embrace the role of a professor as a disruptor while continuing to be flagship carriers of our discipline? This evening, we will listen to Professor Stein as one further step in the journey of being a professor. This is a journey which does not culminate once this lecture has been given. It is a self-reflective pause in the journey of the professor with the promise of more to enrich our minds and simultaneously contributing to the rich intellectual body of work in the discipline. Let me now invite the Acting Executive Dean, Professor Heidi Abramse, to introduce Professor Stein. I thank you. Ria leboga, ngiyabonga, baie dankie.
Good evening, colleagues, esteemed dignitaries, family, friends. It's a great honor for me today, this evening, to introduce Professor Christopher Stein to you all, and I'm very honored to share with you his very, very impressive CV. Professor Christopher Stein qualified with a National Diploma in Ambulance and Emergency Care from the Technikon Witwatersrand in 1994. After working in a private emergency medical service, he joined the Technikon Witwatersrand as a lecturer in the Department of Emergency Medical Care on 1 May 1998. He completed his bachelor's degrees in post-school education and emergency medical care in 1999 and 2001. Between 1998 and 2008, Prof. Stein lectured many first-year and second-year undergraduate modules before taking over coordination of the BTech degree final year in 2009. Over this time, he also supervised clinical work and implemented a clinical learning database that was used in the department until 2017. He registered as an emergency care practitioner in 2010 with the Health Professions Council of South Africa. In 2005, Professor Stein completed a BSc in Computer Science and Information Systems and an Honours in Computer Science in 2008 from UNISA, followed by a Master's degree in EMC with WITS in 2010. In 2011, he was promoted to senior lecturer and started a PhD in emergency medicine in 2012, which he completed in 2014. In the years leading up to 2015, he was involved in accreditation of the department's master's program and coordinated the department's postgraduate program from its inception, with a doctoral qualification added in 2018. In 2017, Prof. Stein was promoted to associate professor, and in 2021 to professor. He's currently trying very hard. No, not with limited success. He's trying very hard and succeeding to finish a PhD in bioethics and health law at WITS. Professor Stein served on the Council of the South African Association of Health Educationalists between 2010 and 2014, was a member of the organizing committee for the SAAHE conference held in Johannesburg in 2010. He was a member of the Executive Committee of the African Federation for Emergency Medicine between 2013 and 2019, and he also chaired the AFEM's Out-of-Hospital Emergency Care Committee between 2012 13 and 22. He was also a founder of the Emergency Care Society of South Africa and an honorary life membership of this association. He served at this association as president between 2011 and 2017 and edited the Society's professional magazine, Sanguine, between 2011 and 2014. Professor Stein also served on a ministerial review committee on emergency medical services, the Gauteng Provincial Health Research Committee, and a working group on violence and healthcare workers convened by the International Committee of the Red Cross. He's been a panel member in discussions on a range of topics, including ethics and artificial intelligence, research ethics and research integrity and misconduct. He is currently a member of the Northern Region Committee or Community of Practice for Research Ethics and Integrity Steering Committee. Professor Stein also is chair of the Department of Emergency Medical Care Research Committee and as a long-standing member of the Faculty of Health Science Higher Degrees Committee. He's been a member of the Faculty of Health Science Research Ethics Committee and chaired this committee since 2017. He's been a member of the Senate Research Committee since its inception in 2020 and has chaired this committee since 2022. Professor Stein has authored 47 articles in peer-reviewed journals and contributed to more than 40 oral and poster presentations at conferences all over the world. He has either chaired or been a member of several conferences, organizing committees, including the first conference on pre-hospital emergency care held in Johannesburg in 2009. He's been a peer reviewer for many journals, mainly in the discipline of emergency care, but also a health professions education and research ethics. He has supervised and co-supervised 7 masters and 3 doctoral students and many undergraduate research students. He currently holds a Scopus H index of 13 and has applied for NRF rating. Congratulations, Chris. Just reading through this makes me very tired. Well done. It's really a great honor for me. There are, as Professor Swart, the previous Dean of Health Sciences, said earlier, there are very few of us left that's been so long at the Technikon Witwatersrand and then the University of Johannesburg, and we're there to stay for a few more years, I hope. But it's a very great pleasure for me. I've known you for a long time. I salute you, and congratulations on this achievement to you and your family. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Prof. Abraham. So I get a little bit worried when you say there's so few of us left. Sounds quite terminal. BC functionary, Prof. Khan, acting Dean of Health Sciences, Prof. Abraham, Prof. Yelverton, Vice Dean, colleagues, friends, family, thanks very much for being here this evening. I really appreciate it. I think there are a few people online, probably. I hope they've got their popcorn and their drinks. And I think there's another Vice Dean and our acting Dean of Health Sciences who are also online. So welcome to everybody who's online as well. Somebody asked me recently, what is this thing with an inaugural address? What is it all about? And I tried to simplify it as much as possible. So I said that it's kind of, you invite some people around and you do a speech. And in that speech, you tell them what you've been up to. So I think that's probably not a bad summary. The only problem is I've been here for 25 years. So you're probably thinking, God, he's going to keep us here until tomorrow morning. But I've had very strict instructions about time, and I will really try and keep to that time. So I've chosen 3 main areas to talk about this evening. And these are all things that I've been involved in. It's research that I've been involved in, and you can get involved in research for a number of reasons. You can co-supervise students where, for example, the research that's being done is not necessarily your thing. These three things are all my thing. They're things that I have driven or chosen to be involved in myself. So the first one that I want to talk about is, this comes from my PhD that I did a few years ago, and it's about emergency medical services and response times. So you've probably seen things like this. Nobody reads newspapers anymore, but certainly on news websites, about long response times, about the kind of problems that they cause. And if you're thinking this is just a uniquely South African problem, because we do complain a lot about a lot of things here. But this is not just a local problem. So you'll see from these news website headlines, this one is from Australia, for example. They talk about dangerous response times. I'm not entirely sure what that is, but I'm assuming they mean long response times. This one is from Ireland. This one is from London, response times that hit record lows. And this one is from Chicago. So you can see this is a global issue, and it's something that concerns people a lot. So response times are generally seen around the world as, rightly or wrongly, one of the most important performance indicators of emergency medical service systems. Is it a golden metric? I don't think it actually is, but there's no doubt that it's important. It's important to managers and politicians, partly because managers and politicians get the heat when there are problems with response times, but also because they get the performance bonuses when response times look good. But there's no denying that apart from the managers and politicians, this is a matter of public perception. It's quite logical that if you pick up a phone and call EMS, they should be there quite quickly. It makes sense. And so this really is it's an important thing. It's definitely not the only quality indicator, but it's an important thing. Just to quickly unpack what I mean by response times and response intervals, this is a diagram showing the complete mission interval of emergency services. This is typically what people and vehicles do from beginning to end every day. And I just want to focus on this little red block here. This is the response interval. All the others are important, but this is just really what I want to talk about this evening. So you'll see it's made up of three different parts. And the first one is what happens in the dispatch center, from when a call comes in to when a dispatcher has a call that's ready to give to a vehicle. This is traditionally in South Africa been kind of separate from mainstream EMS. So what happens in the dispatch center, it's part of the process, but it's kind of also separate. And the people who arrive at your door don't have a lot of control over what happens in the dispatch center. So that's the first part. The second part, the second part is that black block, and that's called the handoff delay. That's a potential delay that might exist when things get busy. So when a dispatcher has a call to give to a vehicle and there's no vehicle available, then you have a delay. And that obviously affects the response time. At 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, there probably won't be a delay. At 11 o'clock on a Friday evening, there probably will be a delay. So it varies a lot. The response travel interval is the third part, and that is the time that it takes for the vehicle. And you can see everybody complains when we arrive and knock on the door, and they say it's taken 2 hours. But you can see that that's only the last part. The part where we get in the vehicle and travel is just that last little component there. So that whole thing makes up the response interval, and from beginning to end, the time that takes is the response time. So what is a good response time? Is there some kind of benchmark? There isn't really a universal understanding or meaning of what is a good response time. It varies a lot from country to country. In some countries, it's difficult to understand what they consider to be a good response time. I think rightly or wrongly, we often compare ourselves to North America and the UK. I'm not sure it's entirely appropriate, but I just want to talk about them for a moment because that comparison is often made. And we have a lot of information about what their response time benchmarks are. their benchmarks are heavily influenced by cardiac arrest resuscitation. Cardiac arrest is what happens when your heart stops beating, you fall over, and you're clinically dead. So obviously, this is a very time-sensitive emergency. Brain cells undergo irreparable harm from about 4 minutes, and that's pretty much it. So in order to save those patients, you have to have somebody pushing on their chest within 4 minutes, and you have to have an emergency vehicle there within about 8 minutes. That is what research from North America showed in the early 80s. And that is their benchmark, still today. 8 minutes for 90% of high acuity incidents. Now you'll see there's been a bit of a sly shift where it started out being cardiac arrest, and it suddenly became all high acuity incidents, which I don't think is quite right, but nevertheless, that's how it happened. So that is their benchmark, 8 minutes. That's pretty quick. And that's from the time the call gets picked up to when the vehicle arrives at the patient. In South Africa, we also have a benchmark. It's a little bit longer. It's 15 minutes, also for 90% of high acuity patients. So in South Africanese, we call them priority ones or P1s, and that's in urban areas. So there is a distinction between urban and rural. And then in brackets at the end there, I've just put the general benchmark for non-P1s, which is that any other patient should have a vehicle with them within about an hour, roughly. We don't meet this benchmark, ever. If you go back and look at annual reports of provincial health departments, you will see that these have not been met. So the question is there something wrong with the benchmarks? Are the benchmarks over-enthusiastic? Or is there something wrong with the systems that are trying to meet these benchmarks? So that's one of the questions that I was interested in. This is the broader question of my research that I asked. So I looked at EMS systems and different design factors that are involved in these systems. And I asked the question of whether different combinations of these design factors would result in better performance. There are certain assumptions that I made in asking this, and every single one of these assumptions you could question, and there are people sitting over there that I know would love to question these assumptions, but let's leave that for now. Research always has to work with assumptions. So I've listed them there. I'm not going to go through them in detail. So what do I mean by response design factors? There were two that I looked at, and that was whether the systems were single or two-tier. And basically what that means in single-tier systems is that you have a single type of vehicle. So you have a vehicle that you can put a patient in the back and transport them to hospital, which surprises people because they say, you know, don't you always do that? But not necessarily. So in a single-tier system, you might have different people with different qualifications in those vehicles, but you have one type of vehicle that can transport a patient to hospital. Two-tier systems, you have two different types of vehicles. You have a primary response vehicle and a vehicle that can transport patients to hospital. And the idea with a two-tier system is that the calls are prioritized and the primary response vehicle is sent first to the highest priority calls. But it can't transport anybody to hospital. Then an ambulance arrives. At that same call, the patient is handed over, taken to hospital, and that frees up the primary response vehicle to go to the next call. If it sounds complicated, it is. And it's got to work well to work. If this doesn't work, then it just creates problems. So that's basically the difference between single and two-tier. And then the other thing, the other design factor that I looked at was static versus dynamic location of vehicles. So static location of vehicles is like the old fire department system where you have a fixed location in quite a big area and all the vehicles sit at that location until they get a call, they go out, they go to the hospital, they come back. When they come back, they switch on Netflix, they play some pool, and they wait, Connor's smiling, they wait for the next call. So that's the static location of vehicles schema. The dynamic location of vehicles involves vehicles that are spread over a greater area, and they're located at places called holding points. So they're not all placed in one place. And the idea there is that the holding points are placed close to areas of demand. So you tend to have shorter travel times to get to calls. So those are two different ways of doing it. In most services in urban areas in South Africa, it's static. So it's the old fire department system. I realized when I looked at this that by combining these factors, there are 4 possible combinations, that it may be possible that the response time benchmark would not be met by any of them, because in real life it isn't being met. And so what I said is that if none of those combinations achieve that benchmark, I would then add vehicles and see what happens. So the initial design was to work with realistic numbers of vehicles, but I'm sure you've heard people say that the problem with our response times is that we don't have vehicles. There's not enough vehicles. So I decided to test that theory in taking the best performing combination and then add vehicles to it. So you're probably thinking, how did you do this? Did you go and play around with the real system? And I think you can realize that you can't do that. There are ethical reasons why you can't do that. So if you start experimenting with a system and there's a 6-hour response time and somebody dies, then obviously people will ask questions. So ethically, it's not really okay to do that. But also practically, you can't exactly take 10 vehicles and add them to a system. There's a huge cost associated with that. So I decided to look at this problem with simulation modeling. That made me very, very happy because it was a cross-section of 2 things that I really enjoyed. One is obviously emergency care. The other one is computer science, because the roots of simulation modeling are in computer science. So it was great for me. It was very interesting. So I used them. There are many different ways that you can do simulation modeling. I chose discrete event simulation, and basically what that means, those are the characteristics of discrete event simulation that I've listed there. It's a dynamic model, and it's a simulation model that runs, and the state variables, for example, the number of vehicles that are available, where the incidents are located, where the areas of demand are, changes at various points in time as the model runs. These things coincide with events, so it's not a continuous process, and that makes it very efficient to run on a microchip, because the model basically fast forwards until an event happens, and then it goes to the next event and the next event. But it can record very realistic times, so it's a very efficient way of modeling. Just to clarify, if you build a model like this, you don't just run it once and see what happens. So there are many replications that get run, and that produces stochastic data. So in other words, the output of a simulation model like this is data that's derived from probability distributions. And if you look at that data, it actually looks very much like what you would get out of a real system. There are other ways of doing these models that are very mathematical, that very few people can understand, but they give you exact answers. They don't give you probabilistic answers. So I decided to use this approach. One of the reasons was because I got a grant for some lovely software that allowed me to do this with relative ease. So just to run through quickly the different stages of the model development process, the first step is conceptual modeling, and that is basically looking at the system that you're modeling and mapping it out on paper, deciding and understanding how it works. And that depends quite heavily on sitting down and interviewing system experts, so people who work in the system, who know it, speaking to them, trying to understand how it works, and then it's really a really large system of flow diagrams to figure out how the system works. The second part, which is kind of linked to the first, is that you also have to go out and collect real data. So I think there's a perception about simulation models that you kind of make it up. You know, you just create this model, and it's a sort of best guess, and then you run it and see what happens. But what's inside the model actually comes from real data. So I had to go to the city of Cape Town, to their urban EMS operations, and I managed to get 32 months worth of response data. And you can see that it was just over about 300,000 incidents. So it was quite a large data set. And each one of those incidents contained time intervals, all the time intervals that were on that diagram. And then what I had to do with that was analyze the data and figure out what the probability distributions of all those things were and plug them into the model. And that is basically how the model knows to run like the real system. So it's based on those same probability distributions. After all of that, you have to translate, because at that stage you only have a model on paper, you have to translate all of that into a software model. And there are various ways of doing this. One way is to hand code everything, which takes about a century, so I decided not to do that. And as I mentioned previously, I had access to some really cutting-edge software, which made the whole process a lot simpler. It didn't make it easy, but it made it a lot simpler. Once the model is translated and it exists as an application that you can run on a computer, you then have to verify and validate it. And verification basically amounts to building the model correctly. So it's building it technically correctly. And there's another thing that I just want to point out about models is a misperception that you can model a system in its entirety, which you can never do. Even the simplest systems are way too complex to model in their entirety. So what you have to do is start off with a research aim, decide what the purpose of the model is, plug it into that aim, and then build the model to answer a specific question. So that's important to remember, that a model will never answer every question about a system. It has to be an abstraction and a simplification of the real system. So I've chosen words very carefully there. You can't really ever demonstrate that a model is correct, because it doesn't really have a meaning. All you can demonstrate is that it's not incorrect in relation to the threshold of accuracy that you have determined from the aim of your research. So that's verification. Validation refers to building the correct model. So at every step along the way, as every component of the model is generated, you have to stop, and there are various ways of doing this. Check that it's behaving the way that it's supposed to behave as the real system behaves. This is just a quick snapshot. This is one of the flow diagrams. So this is the conceptual modeling stage, and there were many of these flow diagrams mapping out on paper exactly how the system works. And a lot of time is obviously spent on this, because if this step is wrong, that translates incorrectly into the model. So this is just to give you an idea of what that looks like. This is the area that was modeled in Cape Town. So those 4 different colors are 4 different sectors of Cape Town's EMS system, and those were the 4 that I chose. The grey area wasn't included in the model, and I had to make a decision. Obviously, as you start moving away from the city centre, some of the areas start becoming kind of semi-rural, and they're not really urban areas anymore, so I excluded them. But also the model has to have some boundaries in terms of how feasible it is to build. So it was only those areas that are coloured there. And those are basically areas that feed 4 big hospitals in Cape Town. That's the picture on the right. The picture on the left is just to give you an idea of mapping out the incidents that I got onto that map of the 4 different sectors. And it shows you how the demand for EMS varies geospatially. So the red areas are areas of very, very high demand for EMS response. The cream-colored dots are sort of in between areas, and the blue areas are the quieter areas. And this has to all be represented in the model, so that it's a realistic reflection of what actually happens in reality. These 2 pictures are just a kind of a zoom into the one sector. This is sector 2, that's a drainage area for GF Jooste Hospital, and you can see where the hospital is located there. Those green dots are the holding points. And those are where the vehicles, at the beginning of every shift, they are sent out, located at those positions. So this is a dynamic way of locating vehicles. The image on the left is a GIS picture. That's how it looks on a map. The image on the right is how it translated into the actual simulation modeling software and how it was replicated there. It would be lovely if I had an animation. I just don't have one anymore. But you can actually run this system and you can watch it. So you can actually watch the vehicles responding. You can have a lot of fun. You can speed it up and see them go 3 times their normal speed, and hope that none of them collide with each other. All right, so that was the model. Some of the results very briefly. What I'm showing you is a very small subset of everything that came out of the model, but it's related to that first broad question that I asked. And you can see here these 4 bars are basically that whole response interval, that whole mission interval. But the areas of interest are on the left, and it's the red block and the dark gray block next to the red block. So the red block is the handoff delay, and the gray block next to it is the travel time. And you can see that the best performing model in terms of response time, obviously the black block on the left, the far left-hand side, didn't change very much from simulation to simulation. That's what happened in the dispatch center. So that wasn't really a response issue. But you can see the best performing model was the one at the bottom, and that was the single tier dynamic system. So that was the one with one type of vehicle where the vehicles are spread geographically over a wider area. So that's how it looked graphically. In terms of numbers, the table at the top shows you the mean response times. So this is over many replications. It was a lot of data, and I modeled 14 days of time for each replication. So it gives you quite a good idea of how the system is working. And you can see again the single tier dynamic model performed the best, a mean response time of 14 minutes, which by North American UK standards is still quite long, but that was the best performing one. The table at the bottom shows you the percentage of total responses that met the benchmark of 15 minutes. And again, you can see the single tier dynamic system was the best. It was around about 70%, just off 70%. But remember that the benchmark is 90%. And so we're still quite far off the benchmark with the best performing model. So that was that one in red. So as I said I would do in the beginning, I then took that best performing model, and it's easy to do in simulation. You can obviously not do this in real life, but in a simulation model, you can change whatever you want. So I started adding vehicles, and you can see that in this table. It gets a little bit more complicated than it sounds, though, because they're different types of vehicles, and you've obviously got to know where to add them. You can't just throw vehicles into the model because it doesn't know what to do with them. But the useful columns, I think, for this evening in this table are the total column that just shows you how the total number of vehicles increased over each different scenario where I added more. The availability column shows you an average of the number of vehicles that were available, in other words, not doing anything. And you can see it starts off pretty high, which indicates to you that even though that was the best performing model, there's still quite a lot of redundancy in that model. But you can see as we go through the 7 scenarios, it gets up to almost 100%. So although things are getting better in terms of response time, it's at a very big cost because there are many more vehicles hanging around doing nothing. The P1 percentage column shows you the percentage of responses, priority 1 responses. That's all I'm focusing on for this evening. There were others in the model. But it shows you the percentage of P1 responses that were within that 15-minute target. And you can see that the best that I managed to squeeze out of it was about 84%, bearing in mind that the benchmark is actually 90%. So it got better, but we didn't quite get there. And then you can see in the far right column the percentage increase in better performance, and you can see it starts off with quite a big jump of about 14%, and then it degrades and eventually goes down to nothing by scenario number 7. So what accounted for this improvement in performance was basically only one thing, and that was cutting the handoff delay. So you can see on this chart, it shows you the percentage improvement in benchmark achievement as a function of handoff delay. So you can see the handoff delay at the bottom there starts at about a minute, roughly, close to a minute, and then it shrinks a lot with the first increment of additional vehicles, and then after that it just it plateaus, and eventually it ends up at nothing. So by adding more and more vehicles, you cut the handoff delay down eventually to nothing, but you still don't achieve the benchmark. So what does this all mean in summary? It basically means that, as we've said already, the best performing combination of design factors is single tier dynamic. And I mention that again because this is what you will not find in most urban systems in South Africa. To my knowledge, the only one that actually combines these at the moment is Cape Town. If you go around and look at other big cities, big urban EMS systems, you find other things, not this. So that's quite important. Did it achieve the benchmark with realistic vehicle numbers in that initial model? No, it didn't. What was the effect of increasing vehicle numbers? Well, we've just seen that now, and it was a decrease in the handoff delay. That shrunk right down with about a 20% in total gain in response time, but it took 278 additional vehicles eventually to achieve that with very high redundancy. Did any number of additional vehicles achieve the benchmark? No, it didn't. So the people who in press conferences will say to you, we'd love to give you better response times, but our budget is used up and we can't buy you the vehicles. It's not true. Well, in a model, anyway, it's not true. It's important to remember that limitation. What was the cost? What was the cost of achieving that 20% improvement, which still wasn't on the benchmark? I'm not going to be like our former president and try and say this number. It's a long number. But it's about R1 billion. Or you can think of it about per percentage gain in response time, it's about 50 million. Please bear in mind these are costs from several years ago, and these costs were costs of the vehicle, the medical equipment that goes in the vehicle, and the people that use the medical equipment that goes in the vehicle. These were not running costs. So it's still got to include running costs as well. So what is the bottom line of all of this? Trying to add vehicles to a system, as is often done, without changing anything else about the system is futile. It's not going to achieve anything really. A dynamic system that optimizes allocation and reallocation and tries to match resources with demand, and this should not come as any surprise, that when we're able to match resources with demand, things happen. Okay, but for some reason we haven't learned this in EMS. But that is the thing that works best. And in some services in the US, for example, this has become very advanced. So they have all sorts of fancy systems that shift vehicles around as demand changes. So that is very advanced. But there are basic things that we could change about EMS in this country that I think would improve the situation without spending vast amounts of money on more vehicles. So that is the response side of things. The second thing is also about simulation, and I was trying to be clever with the title and choose words that all started with an R. So it started off with response. Problem is simulation starts with an S. So I went to thesaurus.com, and they told me that a synonym for simulation is replication, which it is. So I put that word in. What I'm actually talking about is simulation, but a different type of simulation. So I'm talking about, in this section, clinical simulation. So this is students in our simulation laboratory doing emergency care in a safe environment where they can learn and patients don't get harmed if they make a mistake. So that's really what simulation is all about. There are quite a number of reasons why simulation assessment, which is what I'm focusing on this evening, is stressful for students. You might well say that any assessment is stressful for students. If you give somebody an exam paper, stressful. We all know that. And that is true. But there's certain things about simulation assessments that make them more stressful for students. So the first one is that everything happens in real time. If you're doing a written exam, you get the paper, you can read through it. There are time limits, but if you decide that question one you didn't really study that well for, you can leave that to the end, you can move things around, you can make decisions. In a simulation, it's real time, things happen, and you've got to deal with things as they happen. And there's a reason for that. It's because that is how things really work. Dealing with consequences of actions, that often places a lot of pressure on students. So as the simulation unfolds, things happen. And of course, as they do things, things happen. And when something goes wrong, a student does something and a heart rate drops, or a blood pressure drops, or something untoward happens, they have the burden of trying to figure out what happened, trying to deal with that, but also trying to keep the case going along in the background. So that creates a lot of stress. The one that I actually probably should have put right at the top is the third one there, and that is being observed and judged. So socio-evaluative stress is a very, very well-known, significant form of stress. Another form of this is public speaking, just in case you're wondering. And then the last one there, to be fair, this is not something specific to simulation, but it's something that I've highlighted because I want to pick it up a little bit further on. It turns out this is very, very important, what the consequences of the outcome are. So just very briefly, there's a lot of theory underlying all of this stuff, but just to quickly touch on a little part of it, there's this theory about the two-stage situational appraisal model of stress, and basically what it amounts to is a student walking into a simulation assessment and figuring out what the demands are to deal with that patient, and the stressors associated with that. Very quickly, they then appraise their own resources that are available, and they do a kind of a calculus. So we all do this. So it's not just students, it's not just simulation assessments. Whenever we're faced with a stressful situation, we do this. If that calculus results in us realizing that we have the resources to meet the demand, we see that as a challenge. So you can think of that as kind of being faced with some kind of stress, but realizing that you can cope with it. It then becomes a positive experience. If the calculus is done and the result of that is that you don't have the resources to meet that demand, that then becomes a threat, according to this model, and that is really the source of anxiety. It's when students feel overwhelmed, they don't have the resources to deal with it, that they become anxious. And anxiety has a lot of spin-offs. It's a negative feedback loop. So anxiety tends to make you more anxious. And also there is some suggestion that it can affect performance as well, and I'll show you something about that in a moment. I think you probably agree with that. Sounds like a really silly comment. Yogi Berra was one of the all-time best baseball catchers. And he's well known for these types of statements and comments. And on the face of it, it sounds quite silly until you realize that it's possible to watch without observing. It is definitely possible. So over many, many years, I ran simulation assessments for a long, long time, and I was watching and observing and noticing that anxiety seemed to be quite a big thing for many of the students. And it was quite weird because I was seeing this in the simulation environment, but when we went into a clinical environment, there were students that seemed to be okay, that weren't really rattled with what was going on, but put them back in the simulation laboratory, and suddenly they were very anxious. They also seemed to be making, in simulations, a lot of judgment errors. So not errors with psychomotor skills, those were generally okay, but they tended to make clinical decision-making errors that they were unaware of, which seemed to me very, very odd. So I decided to have a look at this. And one of the first questions that needed to be asked was whether my perceptions were correct or not. And so it was a very basic question, just to measure what was going on. What was happening with students' levels of stress and with the anxiety in simulations, because it may have just been my perception that this was a problem. So I took a sample of first through to fourth year students and used two ways of assessing this. The way that I measured stress was with heart rate variability, which sounds very simple, but it's actually quite complicated, I found out. And so that is where you put a small heart rate monitor onto the student's chest with two electrodes. They're completely unaware of it during the simulation. It's a tiny little device. You take it off at the end and then you analyze that data. And the second one was a 40-item questionnaire, a validated tool to measure anxiety. So that's an example of the questionnaire. 40 items sounds like a lot, but you can see they're very, very simple questions. So you can complete this quite quickly. And this measures both state and trait anxiety. So state anxiety is anxiety in the moment, and it's usually a response to something. Trait anxiety is a personal, kind of relatively stable, long-term propensity to anxiety that individuals have, and it differs from person to person. That's the output from heart rate variability analysis software. You can see it's very busy. There's a lot in there. You wouldn't imagine you could pull all of this out of a simple ECG recording, but you can. So I didn't use all of this. I just used a few of the variables, which I'll show you now. So for this one, what I did was I took those students in their simulation assessments. These were authentic, real assessments with consequences. And then I brought those same students in. I asked them to come in on a different day when they weren't doing any assessments, and I did the same measurements. So that was the control observation group. And you can see what the difference was. So at rest, in the control group, their heart rate was around about 73, absolutely normal for an adult. The anxiety, state anxiety scores were around about 34. And I've put the norms at the bottom. So you can see they were actually slightly below the norm. These are norms for university students. And then you can see in the simulation assessment what the difference was. So their heart rate suddenly shot up to 107 on average. Some of them were a bit higher than that. And their anxiety scores were around 60. So 60 is obviously a lot higher than 33, but how do you put that into perspective? I'm just mentioning the abbreviations, the terrible abbreviations that I have in there. Those are all heart rate variability variables that tell you different things about the autonomic nervous system. I don't have time to go into those details. I've just highlighted the ones that I want to show you. This was analysis of the differences between the groups. And the most important thing is the column on the right-hand side, which is the magnitude of the size of the effect in that comparison. Anything above 0.8 to 1 is a large effect size. That means whatever you're studying is having a big effect. And so you can see for both heart rate and anxiety scores, it was big. To put it into context, I managed to find 3 other studies that were relatively similar that also used the state trait anxiety inventory. So obviously you have to compare apples with apples. It becomes very difficult comparing anxiety scores measured with different tools. So I only managed to find these 3. And you can see that they're different populations. The one was paramedics, the others were doctors. They all claimed to expose these people to high stress simulations, although people's ideas of what high stress is does vary a bit. But you can see what they came up with. So these people were barely even anxious, really, if you think about what the norms were, the norms for males and females. Compare that to our students who were sitting at around 60. Okay, so that puts things into perspective. The heart rate variability data, I must say, was generally associated with quite small effects, and it turned out to not really be a very sensitive measure of stress from what I observed. So that was the first question. The second question, this was a master's study. It was done a few years ago. And this asked the question of what the role of socio-evaluative stress actually was. So the hypothesis was that if students are doing a simulation assessment and we have assessors or examiners visible to them, then that will stress them out, because that's the whole theory behind socio-evaluative stress. If we take the assessors away and hide them away, we hypothesize there might be less stress because they're not that aware that they're being observed. So that's exactly what we did. We used mock assessments because for ethical reasons we were manipulating a variable and we weren't sure what effect that might have on marks. So we decided to go with mock assessments, but I just want to highlight these were done in exactly the same way as every other normal assessment is done. For this one we measured stress with, again, heart rate variability, but we also used salivary cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone and it's released quite quickly when somebody is exposed to stress, and it's very useful that you can get it from saliva. Although I must say, the other thing that is associated with stress is a dry mouth. So this turned out to actually be quite difficult. But we did get the saliva in the end, and then we used the STAI again as an anxiety score. Just to give you an idea of what this looked like, so the picture on the left is the simulation laboratory with the desks set up where the assessors normally sit, and you can see they're quite close to the students. Students are busy doing their thing, and they can make eye contact with assessors. And we theorized that that would be quite a big factor, that they have the assessors right in front of them. The picture on the right was the other group where the assessors were taken into a separate room, and they watched the simulation on those screens. They got 2 camera angles on the left and right, and then they got the output from the simulation monitor in the middle, so they could see what the ECG was, they could see what the oxygen saturations were, etc., etc. So what did we find here? There's a whole table of a lot of stuff here. But basically the things that varied between the groups were heart rate. Now if you look at the numbers there between visible and not visible, they don't look like big differences, but they were associated with reasonably moderate effect sizes actually. Please note where the higher heart rate is. That's quite interesting. And then we found another difference, again with a quite moderate effect size, in salivary cortisol in the post-test. So we took saliva samples before the simulation and after, and we found in the post-test that again, the numbers are not big, but the effect is quite moderate in size, a difference between the groups. And again, we found the higher levels where the assessors were not visible. The other thing to note here at the top is these people were quite relaxed. Okay, so these were simulation assessments that were done exactly the same way as we always do them. We used assessors that we normally use, and the students came in, and according to their anxiety scores, they were enjoying it. They were quite relaxed. So that's important as well. These are just the comparisons to show you the effect sizes. And again, you can see quite moderate effect sizes for those 2 things, for the salivary cortisol and the heart rate. So what does this mean? It means that in general with this study, I think it was a little bit underpowered. We did do a sample size calculation with available data, but it turned out the data that we got was a little bit different to what we had available for the calculation. So I think it was underpowered. But we did see some moderate effect sizes with heart rate and cortisol levels, as I've said already. But even if you look at the others, the differences are not very big. But they all kind of triangulate, and they all agree with each other. And what they're saying is that it seems to be that the students who are more stressed are actually in the group or in the condition where they couldn't see the assessors, which was quite surprising. And it may well be that there is perhaps a source of anxiety in knowing that you're being assessed, but not being able to actually see what's going on, who's assessing you, and what's happening. Perhaps the most important thing is that and I'm going to link this in a little bit later on, the anxiety scores were not high here. These were mock assessments. So that was kind of a chance finding. It wasn't the aim of the study to look at that, but that was very interesting. So just another 2 quick ones related to this that I've done. The question here was, is there a relationship between anxiety and performance? There's quite a lot that's been written in the literature about this, and it varies a lot. So I took the same data set that was used for the first study, added marks to it as an index of performance, and we're quite lucky in our department that we use the same tool to assess marks across all years. All assessments are done the same way, so that standardizes it a lot. And then I looked at that. I thought this relationship would be linear. That's what I expected. I tried to fit a straight line through this data, and it didn't fit. And so I went through a curve fitting procedure, trying to fit a whole lot of different curves, and this was the one that fitted the best. It was the only one that actually had a really good fit, this negative quadratic curve, and that was also quite a surprise. It was a surprise mainly because of these people. So these are students who, despite very high anxiety scores, so we had an average of 60 previously. If If you look at the bottom there towards the right, we're getting into 70 and 80. So that's really, really high, yet they performed well. And we still don't know really why that is. A lot of the theory about this says that there is a linear relationship, that the more you stress people out, the more poorly they perform. So this was another very interesting one that needs to be looked at a lot more closely. Also needs to be corroborated because this was only one assessment with one group of students. Last question on this one that I asked is, again, using existing data sets. I was quite intrigued by doing the mock assessments and seeing that the anxiety scores were low. I didn't expect them to be that low. It was almost like these people were sort of, watching TV at home. And so I compared that to some of the other data that was collected previously, and it's very interesting. So what we have is a comparison that's really not prone to much bias because all of these simulations were done exactly the same way, identically. And so the only thing that can really vary that much is the consequences. One had consequences and one didn't. And so these are the results. The yellow blocks are things that are variables that were collected and measured between the groups, but they were not related to the research question. So if these groups and the comparison is relatively unbiased, what we would expect to see here is not much of a difference. We would expect to have these variables fairly equally distributed between the groups. And luckily you can see that they are. So the gender distribution is very similar. The age distribution is very similar. And I included trait anxiety here just to make sure that we weren't dealing with big differences between the groups because these weren't randomly allocated. So there could have been bias. But luckily there wasn't a big difference. And so what are the things that did differ were all of these. And you can see really big differences between heart rate and also post-assessment anxiety scores. So this was almost a kind of a chance result that I thought was really interesting. It's just that single factor of whether an assessment counts is really affects heavily the stress and anxiety that students feel. I'm not sure there's much we can do about that. We can't make the assessments not count. But there may be alternative ways that we can look at assessment that addresses that factor somehow. So if just a few final thoughts. I think this is important not, people often say, well, students get anxious during assessments. There's not much you can do about it. I think some of these things might be possibly modifiable. There are some interventions. There is some research going at the moment looking at this. But the other thing is that it negatively affects validity of our assessments. So when we set up an assessment tool or a rubric, we don't assume that students are very anxious. We always have this picture in our minds of, what is competence? It's kind of that benchmark of the calm person just doing their job. And so I think it has implications there as well. Future research, there's a lot that we can look at, other different ways of measuring stress other than heart rate variability. And I haven't even mentioned theory. There's a lot of very rich theory that exists in the psychology literature about all of this stuff. I've listed some of those things there. Many of these theories have not been tested. And so that's another avenue of a lot of research. Investigating interventions, that's going at the moment. And then I think something that's really important is to try and understand whether we're seeing the same things when students see real patients. Because they tell us they're quite relaxed when they have real patients in front of them and they're very stressed by simulations. That makes absolutely no sense to me. Because real patients can really be harmed, they can really die. And yet, the students say, no, we're quite comfortable with that. It's when you take us to the simulation lab that we get really anxious. So we haven't really figured out what's going on in the clinical environment, and that needs to be done. Okay, so I'm moving away completely from simulation now. This is the third and last part. And this is from my unfinished work. Let's just call it that. The other PhD, which I am really trying to get done. And this is to do with research ethics. So it's a complete change of direction. But it's related to pre-hospital care. Obviously, that is my interest. So I think you'll agree pre-hospital emergency care happens in this environment which is very unfriendly. And that phrase of anyone, anything, anytime is actually the title of a book that was written in America, and it was a book about the historical development of emergency medicine. I think it's quite a good title because that is really what emergency care is about, anyone, anything, anytime. And the problem is that a lot of the valuable clinical research in emergency care involves patients who have various derangements of physiology, things like altered consciousness, acute severe pain, anxiety, difficulty breathing, and a range of other things that affect their ability to think. And that is important from a research ethics perspective because they obviously need to consent to the research, and they're the very people who often can't. So how do we make decisions in research ethics? There are a number of things that are taken into account. One of them is the ethical principles, and some people might be familiar with those. Respect for persons, autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. I've called it the Georgetown mantra because it originally comes from the Belmont Report, which was published in 1979. But there were two philosophers who took what was in the Belmont Report and kind of extended it in probably the most influential book on bioethics called The Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And those authors are Bashar and Childress, and they both worked at the University of Georgetown in Washington when version 1 or edition 1 of the book came out. So that's why people call this the Georgetown mantra. And it has had a major effect on research ethics in healthcare. It's pretty much the only thing, is why it's called a mantra. It's pretty much the only thing that people talk about in research ethics is these 4 ethical principles. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So we can look to principles to guide us to make decisions. We can look at guidelines. There are many international guidelines and local ones which to a greater or lesser extent codify these principles, but they're also drawn on many other sources as well. And then, of course, we have statute, which we are supposed to abide by as well, law. So this is the problem with research ethics, is it most certainly was born in scandal. If you think back to where modern bioethics and research ethics really comes from, it comes from the post-war period and a realization of the terrible things that happened after World War II or during World War II in the concentration camps and the experimentation that was done with people. So it was born in scandal, but we've sort of gone in the other direction for good reason, probably, is that it's been reared and developed in protectionism. So we've sort of gone from the one extreme to the other. So what does the law say about people who can't give consent being included in research? Well, it's written into our Bill of Rights. We're one of the few countries who actually in the Constitution have something about research participation. And it's quite simple. Both the Constitution and the National Health Act basically say, no go. If somebody can't give consent, you can't include them in any research. So that is quite restrictive. I mean, the letter of the law is you cannot do research with these people. And that in itself is actually unethical because there's a lot of very meaningful and useful research, potentially beneficial for those participants themselves, that could be done that the law effectively prohibits. So what do we do when law constrains activities like this? And there's a very wise lady who's my supervisor who also wishes I would just get finished now. And she always says when you face these kind of challenges, ethics rises above the law. So the law says what the law says, but it shouldn't constrain legitimate ethical scientific research. And so we go back to the principles, and some principles are more equal than others. The reality of the situation is that there are 4 principles. The Georgetown mantra is those 4 things, but there's only actually really one, and that is autonomy. If you look at the research ethics guidelines and how these things are implemented, it's just really all about autonomy. And that in itself is good, but it's also a problem because in emergency care research, that's exactly where the problem is. So this is really a reflection. A lot of this is US-based. The Georgetown mantra is American. And people in Europe get quite frustrated because they have other ways of thinking and looking about ethics, for example, and there's always a bit of a debate about this. They see the four principles as a very American thing, which it is. And it comes from this liberal individualist perspective of society and politics. So just to demonstrate to you that actually all four principles are really all about autonomy, have a look at beneficence. What is it actually? It's being empowered to live an autonomous life. It's autonomy. What is non-maleficence? Negative liberty. Having the freedom to choose non-interference. It's autonomy. What is justice? It's autonomy. Okay, so everything ultimately really comes down to autonomy. So this whole thing boiled over in America in the early 90s, where prior to that, research ethics committees, they call them institutional review boards in America, had a big problem deciding how to deal with this. And so they got quite creative, and this was to do with resuscitation research. So in other words, research in patients in cardiac arrest who can't consent. And so the research ethics committees in the US said, well, we don't know really what to do with all of this. There's very little in the guidelines to guide us, which was true at the time. And so they got quite creative and they said, well, can't we use proxies? So we can ask a family member or relative to give consent. So they did that. And then they got even more creative and they said, well, can't we kind of do it first? And then when the patient wakes up, we'll ask them. And that was called deferred consent. And yeah, there are problems with that. So this carried on for quite a while. And then in the early 90s, there was a moratorium placed on emergency care research for 5 years, which was extremely damaging. It basically meant that all emergency care research was stopped. No grants were dispersed or anything like that for any of this research. The whole situation was re-looked at, and it resulted in quite a significant revision of some of the federal regulations. And that allowed for something called an exception to the requirement for informed consent. So under certain circumstances in the US, for example, and in some other countries, you are allowed to apply for an exception or a waiver, which means that you can proceed doing research with incapacitated patients, provided you meet specific conditions. And those are very, very tight conditions. So it's not as if you can just go and do this with anybody. So what's the situation in South Africa? Our local National Health Research Ethics Council guidelines don't actually allow waivers, which some people think is a good thing because waivers are a bit of a dirty word in research ethics. It sounds like you're just sort of doing whatever you want with patients. Yet they still do allow those things that came up in America years ago. We still allow proxy consent according to the guidelines, and we still allow delayed consent. There are problems with both of those. Proxy consent is fine if they're proxies. If there are no proxies, no consent. The other problem with proxy consent is there have been a number of studies that have been done showing that there are often quite vast differences between what proxies want and what real patients want. So this is quite creative research. I can't go into it now. But it basically demonstrates that if I'm the patient and I indicate a desire for certain things, if you go and ask my wife, she often has quite different ideas, which is not surprising because wives often have very different ideas about a lot of things. So do husbands. It's not. But we have this sort of idealized version in our heads about proxy consent that we always agree and we're always on the same page, but often it's not true. And then there's a requirement of minimal risk, and I'll speak about that in a moment as well. So just to wrap this up, the question that I'm asking, apart from a number of other questions, is if we wanted to improve the South African guidelines, how would that look? What should we be doing? And there are a few things that come into that. The first thing is to acknowledge that the Georgetown mantra is quite restrictive. There's nothing wrong with it per se, but it doesn't allow us to look at complex ethical problems from a number of different perspectives. Here's an interesting one. This is an author using a pretty much a communitarian type of public good argument, saying that, in fact, participation in scientific research should be a moral duty. Everybody should do it. I can't go into the details of this. There was a second article that was written. We just don't have the time, but it's a fascinating article. Don't hold your breath. I don't think this is going to happen. But it's a very convincing argument. And it shows what happens if you put the four principles aside and you look at things from a slightly different perspective. It's always a good thing to do that. So I think from a theoretical perspective, there's much more latitude that is needed. We need to look at what minimal risk means. This is an international guideline definition of the minimal risk standard. It doesn't really look as if it's suited to emergency care. Okay, so they're talking about the risks of daily life, and they're talking about average healthy individuals. So that is the risk level that is associated with minimal risk. So if you're doing emergency care research, your interventions must be as risky as daily life. It doesn't really seem to make sense. This is a very, very complex problem, but it's quite a barrier, actually, and it needs to be addressed. I think there is definitely a place for waivers. Waivers sound bad. It sounds like you're giving researchers carte blanche to just go ahead and do what they want, but that's actually not what waivers are all about. And there definitely is a place for them if they are structured correctly. We also do need to fix terminology, so there's actually no such thing as delayed consent. Consent has to be prospective. I can't do something to you and then ask you afterwards. The other problem is that there are many patients in emergency care research who could never give delayed consent. They either die or they never recover. And that's actually quite dishonest to say we're using delayed consent knowing that some patients will never recover capacity. And I think this is probably for me the biggest thing, is that there's only one country currently that in its research ethics guidelines says anything about pain and the role that this plays in autonomy and informed consent. And that's Australia, interestingly enough. And it's really crazy to think that we can be doing research involving patients with severe pain, with very stressful, anxiety-provoking experiences, the worst day of your life. That's what an emergency is. And really approaching informed consent in the same way. Producing the 15-page information letter. Here, would you just read this, before I do the research? So there are different ways of getting informed consent, and I think we need to be a lot more creative with that. And in Australia, for example, you can apply for a waiver because a patient has pain, which I think is actually very progressive. A lot of people frown on it, but I think it's good. This is a quote taken from a qualitative study, which I think will find favor with certain people in the audience. A qualitative study on patients who were enrolled in a clinical trial that was testing thrombolytic drugs. So thrombolytic drugs are clot busters that are used when somebody's having a cardiac arrest. Not a cardiac arrest, a heart attack. And a heart attack is something that's associated with severe pain. You can ask anybody who's had one. And so this is a direct quote from one of the participants who was asked, what do you remember about this process of consent? And that's what he said. He remembered nothing about it. And you actually feel sorry for this guy if you read the last sentence. I tried to read the information, and remember these information letters are 10, 15, 20 pages. I tried to read the information, but I just didn't get it. Okay, so this is the abstract of the study. And it basically is suggesting that our whole approach to this is wrong. Patients are giving consent. We're calling it, autonomy, and they're exercising their autonomy. It seems to be nothing of the kind. And I found that last sentence fascinating. This is from Sweden. And I don't know if things are very different in Sweden. But most of these patients said that they were quite happy if they didn't have the capacity to consent to allow their doctor to make the decision. for them. I'm not saying that's the way we must go, but it's very, very interesting. And then lastly, this is the last thing from the section, and it's the last section as well. Law reform is a very, very long, almost impossibly long and difficult process. But I think that there needs to be some change to the very restrictive laws that we have about informed consent. And it's not just emergency care research. You think about Alzheimer's research, you're dealing with the same problems. Patients who don't have the capacity to give consent. So the Constitution and the National Health Act seems to be protecting people who want to say no, which is fine. But we also need to recognize the rights of people who might want to say yes, because the research offers them potential benefits. And we are currently cutting those people out. So I've got close to the end. You'll be very happy to hear. And I just want to carry one thread of this bioethics stuff through to the last two slides. And that I don't mean this literally, but if I were not to finish, I don't mean it literally, but if I were not to finish this other PhD, I feel that I still would have benefited immensely from doing it, even if I didn't finish it. And the reason why I say that is because in the dark, I stumbled across a number of things. And I got to read a lot of philosophy. I've never really read philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. I've never studied it. But I found it immensely interesting. And so for the benefit of that, I would say that it was worth it, even if I didn't get a piece of paper, which I do intend to get. And so just to end off, I'd like to talk about one of those things that I stumbled across. Two of them, in fact. One of them was a very useful other way of looking at research ethics, and that is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics is hidden away in research ethics training. Nobody really talks about it very much. But it's a fascinating way of thinking about ethics, and it's all about character. And it's about how you align your actions to various virtuous character traits. It's a completely different perspective, and I found it fascinating. Linked into that was another stumble, and that was Stoic philosophy, which I discovered while I was reading all the stuff. I think one of the reasons it's taken so long is there was stuff I had to read, which was a lot, and then there was stuff that I chose to read, which is why I'm in year 6 at the moment. So that brings me onto the second last slide, which is a change of scenery. And I'd like to arrange a few final thoughts around a virtue. And there are 4 cardinal Stoic virtues, which I'm not going to repeat because I'll probably forget at least one of them. But I haven't chosen one of those. If you look at Stoic philosophy and you look at it very carefully and you look quite deeply at it, there's a really important virtue that hides away in the background, but it is there. And it's this one here. And the reason why I want to mention this is because I think the way we live our lives at the moment, this is a lost art. We often don't ever think about this virtue. And it's really important. We're so caught up in all the crises that we see when we read the news. We're so caught up in all the issues, all the negativity, and we really seldom take time to reflect on gratitude. I really think it's an important virtue. Apparently, when I was born, shortly after I was born, you're probably wondering what this has got to do with gratitude, but shortly after I was born, my mom was lying there, I was lying there, and a nursing sister was there talking to her, just making conversation. And she inquired about the family background and ancestry. So my mom said to her, well, one side of the family is Irish, and the other side is German. And so she paused for a while, and she thought quite deeply. And then she said, well, I really hope that your son turns out to have the the industriousness and the work ethic of the Germans, and the sense of humor of the Irish, and not the other way around. And for when I lecture undergrads, often they have a lot of questions, and often there's not time to address all of the questions. So what I say to them is I'll give them a few pointers, and then I'll say, I leave this to you as an exercise. You can go away, there's a lot of information available, you can answer your own question. So whether the nursing sister got it right, or whether she mixed it up completely, I leave to you as an exercise. But we all owe immense debts of gratitude, and there are a lot of people sitting here in front that I owe a great debt to. It's probably not healthy to think of gratitude as a debt, but if you did, I think I'd be out of repayment options for the gratitude that I owe them. It's also about people that are no longer with us, people that we've said goodbye to, whether we said that a long time ago, whether we said it recently, just being grateful for the time that we had with them, that we could share with them. That's also a big part of gratitude for me. It's also about colleagues in the department. And I got an email from Human Resources a few weeks ago saying, there's this long service award function in November. You need to give us a few things. And one of the things they wanted was 2 sentences saying why I'm still here, which I found quite interesting. I wasn't sure I had to motivate why I was still here. So I could have just quickly fired off a response, but I decided to think about it. And I ended up, it was a bit like Stoic philosophy, I thought a long time about it. And I came down to 2 things. I can't remember the exact words that I put down. The first thing was freedom. And the second thing was fellowship. And so what that means for me in the department is that I've been lucky to have immense freedom to really chart my own course in what I want to do. And I don't think you find that in every department. I don't think you find it in every university, but I'm very grateful for that. And then also just, I don't know how to put it into words, but just the fact that I wake up every morning and I still am eager and keen to come to work. There's certain things that could explain that, probably. I find my work interesting, which is wonderful. But I think it's got a lot to do with the people that I work with and about the dynamic in the department as well. So I'm very, very grateful for that too. And so that's my final thought, is that I like to spend a lot of time thinking about this. I don't think we think about it enough. And to everybody who's watching and everybody who's out there online as well, I'm very grateful for all of that, for all of you. The last slide, this really is the last slide, has some words on it that has got absolutely nothing to do with anything else that I've said. I just think they're really nice words, and I could put a last slide in, so I put it in. And this is the last slide. Takes a while. It's a fade. This is my last thought on gratitude. It's easy to be grateful for the positive things and the people that you love and the people that are close to you. But this is what Seneca said about misfortune. I don't think he literally meant that there were a whole lot of people running around who've never experienced misfortune. That people like that don't exist. But he was trying to get a point across. And that is that gratitude is very, very broad. For me, it even covers the negative things. It covers the misfortune. It covers the adversity. And these are the things that we can really learn so much about ourselves from. So for me, gratitude extends even to those things. To be grateful sounds really weird. To be grateful for misfortune. But Stoic philosophy is about turning things in your head. And it's about perception and realizing that you can really be grateful even for the adverse things that happen in your life. And that's what Marcus Aurelius said in relation to this. I think these 2 quotes are quite well connected. The first thing is to receive. So receiving for me is about everyday life. It's about when things go right, it's about the good things, the promotions, the NRF ratings, hopefully, and all those good things. But to receive them without pride. And for the bad things and the things that go wrong, we can learn so much from them, but then we need to let them go. Let them go without attachment and move on. And that was really one of the big Stoic teachings. So I recommend you do this. I think these are beautiful words. And I'm really grateful for everybody. I know your time is valuable. Everybody's time is valuable. It's not unlimited either. And I'm immensely grateful that you've given up an hour. It's probably more than an hour now, but an hour to be here for me. And happy star watching. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The VC functionary, Professor Sam Khan, Professor Heidi Abramser, the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, and all guests and the family of Christopher Stein. So maybe I should start off with what you ended off with, and that's gratitude. I think I can speak on behalf of everyone here in saying we're grateful for you. We have a debt of gratitude to you for all the fantastic work that you've done, and this is only just, it's just a small part of what Chris has done in his career here. But we thank you for sharing that with us. We thank you for, pushing the boundaries of knowledge in all of these areas. And I'll talk just very briefly on each of these, just to sort of try and encapsulate how important this kind of work he has contributed to all of us. So if you take the response time, I mean, in the emergency world, we talk about the chain of survival. Those of you in the emergency care know about the chain of survival. And the chain of survival philosophy is that the faster you all of these things, all these links, how quickly a person gets responded to, how quickly CPR is done, how quickly the call is made to the emergency services, and how quickly that the patient gets into care, all count. And so the kind of work that you've done unpacking this is fantastic. And it tells us that it's no good just throwing money and resources, because that's how we think, right? The more resources you have, the more money you have, will solve the problem. But it actually takes science and a lot of complex thinking and analysis, and the kind of modeling you did. I learned quite a bit about modeling just now, and it's very interesting. That you can then start solving really complex problems. So thank you for sharing that with us, Chris. That was, and I think many of you will agree with me that in the way Chris broke down really complex concepts and the work that he's done for years, if not decades, you can see the teacher in him. You can see the professor in him, in that he's been able to simplify very complex ideas into very simple ones that anyone could follow quite quickly and easily. Thank you for that. Simulation, what can I say? I really regard University of Johannesburg as being one of the leaders in simulation training. Just looking at your own simulation lab, I could recognize that picture from the simulation lab. So it's exactly where more research should be done on what the effect of training and assessment in simulation is. That was quite interesting as well, Chris, because it's also an area that a lot of other healthcare faculties are looking at advancing simulation. We talk about simulation training as being such an underutilized tool, but then what you've highlighted is really what are some of the other aspects that you've got to consider about in terms of assessment in the simulation. And that's also very, very fascinating and interesting, and I hope more research will be done in that area. And then finally, on the research ethics one, again, I think all of us would agree that that's, you really are championing an area that very few people are, in terms of this population that is underserved, and in fact in an unjust way, that are not participating in research because they are being, in a way, denied those opportunities that research offers people. You know, the late Mayosi from Cape Town, Bongani Mayosi, who passed away. He was the head of the the National Research Council in South Africa. And I remember at one of his meetings said, you know, he was a very, very enthusiastic, very, very bubbly personality. And his view was that every single patient should be on one research protocol or another, simply because of the benefits. You know, yes, research has risks, of course, there are consequences and so on. But generally speaking, you know, patients have better care, better monitoring, possibly better outcomes as a result of that. So I applaud you for taking this kind of advocacy role in this, and look forward to seeing more of you championing that area. Thank you very much, and I think we all owe you a deep debt of gratitude. Thank you.
You keep your arms out, but you keep your arms full. It's like a puzzle. This way. Keep your arms full. There we go. Can I come and make it happen in the front? There we go. Congratulations, Chris. Can we give him a round of applause, please? You know, Chris, when I was listening to you, I was thinking, oh, I can't wait for the question and answer session because I want to ask a few questions. And then I realized, wait, there isn't a question and answer session. But I have the opportunity now to ask you a few when we go for refreshments. Colleagues, family members, friends, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Can we give Chris one final round of applause, please? And Chris, I hope with your permission, you will allow this. I don't know that many of us will be able to succeed the way we have without our support system. So can we give your support system and family a round of applause, please? So my final task for the evening is to thank you very much for being here this evening and to invite you to share some refreshments with us in the restaurant. Thank you so much, everyone.
The University of Johannesburg, the future reimagined.